Hello there, and welcome to Mysteries Beneath Earth, where we prefer the quiet rustle of old paper to the noise of the modern world, and where we are willing to sit patiently with questions that have no easy answers. Tonight, we are going to open a file that has been gathering dust for over a century. A file that sits uncomfortably between the clean lines of recorded history and the messy, shadowed world of legend. It is a story about the most famous hole in the ground on our planet, a place so vast and so silent that it feels less like a landscape and more like a separate planet entirely, the Grand Canyon. We look at it today as a park, a place for hiking boots and selfies, a geological layer cake that tells the story of erosion. But in the spring of 1909, if you were walking down the dusty streets of Phoenix, Arizona, picking up a newspaper from a boy on the corner, the Grand Canyon was about to become something else entirely. It was about to become the home of a forbidden history. Before we descend into the canyon, I'd like to ask you a small favor. Check the room around you. Is it quiet? Is the lighting soft? This story requires a bit of stillness, because we are going to travel back to a time when the map of the world still had blank spaces, and when the line between archaeology and adventure was vanishingly thin. And if you find peace in these slow explorations of the impossible, please consider liking the video or subscribing, so we can keep wandering down these strange paths together. Now, let's go back to April 5th, 1909. The city is Phoenix. The paper is the Arizona Gazette. On the front page, buried among advertisements for dry goods and local politics, there was a headline that should have changed the world. It read, in bold, confident type, "Explorations in Grand Canyon." And beneath it, a subheadline that made an even bolder claim, "Mysteries of immense rich cavern being brought to light." The article that followed wasn't a brief blurb or a rumor piece. It was a detailed, specific account of a journey undertaken by a man named G.E. Kincaid. Kincaid was described as an explorer and an archaeologist, a man who had spent 30 years working for the Smithsonian Institution. The story he told the reporter was precise. He claimed that while traveling alone down the Colorado River in a wooden boat, searching for minerals, he had seen something unusual on the canyon wall. It was about 2,000 feet above the riverbed, a section of the sedimentary rock that didn't look quite natural. There were steps, he said, cut into the stone. Steps that had been eroded by centuries of wind and sand, but were unmistakably the work of human hands. Driven by the kind of curiosity that defines all great discoveries, Kincaid beached his boat. He climbed the perilous cliff face, hauling himself up past the layers of red and gold stone until he reached the shelf where the steps ended. There, hidden from the view of anyone on the river unless the light hit it just right, was the entrance to a cave. But this wasn't the kind of rough, jagged cave bear den you might expect. Kincaid described a chisel-cut doorway, smooth and deliberate. He entered, turning on his lantern, and found himself not in a natural cavern, but in a tunnel. The main passageway, he told the Gazette, was nearly 12 feet wide, expanding into a great hall that radiated outward like the spokes of a wheel. And it was full. It was not an empty ruin. It was a warehouse of a civilization that history had forgotten. Kincaid spoke of finding a great room, a kind of shrine or temple, where a massive statue sat cross-legged. He described the idol as resembling Buddha, though not exactly. It held lotus flowers in each hand, and its face was etched with an expression of calm authority. Around this central figure were smaller images, some beautiful, some crooked and distorted, representing, he guessed, good and evil. But the statues were just the beginning. As Kincaid explored further into this underground citadel, he found weaponry, copper instruments as hard as steel, a metallurgical secret that had been lost to time. He found granaries, massive silos carved into the rock, still holding the dust of seeds that had been harvested thousands of years ago. He found pottery with designs that looked distinctly Egyptian or Oriental, not like the geometric patterns of the local indigenous tribes he knew. And then, most chillingly, he found the crypt, a vast chamber filled with mummies. But these were not wrapped in the linen of Egypt. They were wrapped in a clay-like fabric, or perhaps bark, and they were all male. Kincaid noted that there were no women or children in this burial hall, suggesting it was a barracks for warriors, or a monastery for priests. The article in the Gazette goes on to say that Kincaid didn't just keep this to himself. He supposedly sent word to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and they dispatched a Professor S.A. Jordan to manage the site. The article claims that at the time of writing, there were nearly 30 to 40 archaeologists working in the cave, hauling out artifacts, deciphering hieroglyphics that were engraved on urns and tablets, and preparing to reveal the greatest archaeological find of the 20th century to the world. Jordan is much enthused over the discoveries, the article reads, and believes that the find will prove of incalculable value to archaeological science. It concludes with a promise that more information would be released soon, and that a deeper investigation was underway. And then, silence. There was no follow-up article on April 6th. There was no grand press conference from the Smithsonian. There were no photographs published in National Geographic. The story simply vanished, like a stone dropped into a deep well, creating a brief ripple before the water smoothed over again. For decades, the article lay dormant, preserved only on microfiche in library basements. But the idea didn't die. It couldn't die because it touched on something too primal, too exciting. The notion that beneath our feet, especially in a place as ancient and forbidding as the Grand Canyon, there are secrets that challenge everything we know about our past. This wasn't just a story about a cave. It was a story about the possibility that history is wrong, that North America had been visited, or perhaps settled, by cultures from across the ocean thousands of years before Columbus or the Vikings. Or, even more radically, that a great civilization had risen here, independent and advanced, and had been wiped out so thoroughly that only this hole in the wall remained. The description of the cave is hauntingly specific. Kincaid mentioned that the entrance was 1,486 feet down the sheer canyon wall. He mentioned that the ventilation in the cavern was surprisingly good, implying a sophisticated system of air shafts engineered by the builders. He spoke of the gray-eyed mummies, a detail that feels wildly out of place for the region. It is the kind of detail that a fiction writer might add for flavor, or that a truthful witness might report with confusion. The Gazette article stands as the patient zero of this mystery. Without it, we would just have a big canyon. With it, we have a puzzle. Because if Kincaid was lying, he was lying with an extraordinary amount of dry, technical detail. And if he wasn't lying, then where is the cave? Where are the artifacts, and where is G.E. Kincaid? That is where the paper trail ends and the detective work begins. Because when researchers finally started pulling at the threads of this story in the mid-20th century, they found that the fabric of the narrative began to unravel in strange ways. They didn't find a map to the cave. Instead, they found a missing persons case, or rather, a case of people who may never have existed at all. As we turn the page from the 1909 newspaper to the archives of the institutions mentioned, the mystery shifts from what was found to who was hiding it. The Arizona Gazette article is the only primary source we have. No other newspapers in 1909 picked up the story with independent verification. No letters from Kincaid to his family have ever surfaced describing the gold cups or the copper swords. Just that one day, that one headline, and then the long, dusty silence of the desert. But silence, as we know, is rarely empty. Usually, it's full of things people don't want you to hear. When you read a story like the one in the Arizona Gazette, your first instinct is to look for the people involved. If a man claims to have found the eighth wonder of the world, surely he didn't just walk back into the shadows. Surely he wrote a book, or gave lectures, or at the very least appeared in the census. So, let's look for G.E. Kincaid. The article describes him as an explorer and an archaeologist of some renown, specifically stating he had been working for the Smithsonian for 30 years. That is a long career. It suggests a paper trail, payroll records, field reports, correspondence, photographs of dig sites. Yet, when researchers began to contact the Smithsonian Institution in the decades following the article, asking about their illustrious employee G.E. Kincaid, the answer was always the same. We have no record of anyone by that name, no employment history, no field notes, no mention in the annual reports of the institution from 1879 to 1909. It was as if G.E. Kincaid was a ghost. Now, skeptics, and there are many for good reason, point to this as the smoking gun of a hoax. They argue that the Gazette simply made him up. In the era of yellow journalism, newspapers were not above inventing sensational stories to sell copies on a slow news day. A mysterious explorer, a hidden treasure, a connection to the exotic lands of Egypt. It was the perfect recipe to grab a reader's attention for a nickel. But those who want to believe, the hunters of the lost history, have a different explanation. They suggest that Kincaid might have been a contract worker, a freelancer whose name wouldn't appear on the official rolls of tenured professors. Or, more darkly, that his records were scrubbed. If the discovery was deemed too dangerous, too disruptive to the established narrative of American history, perhaps G.E. Kincaid had to be erased. But what about his partner? The article mentions a Professor S.A. Jordan, also of the Smithsonian, who was supposedly supervising the excavation. Surely a professor would be easier to track down. Academics leave trails of papers, citations, and university appointments. Yet, the search for S.A. Jordan hits the exact same wall. The Smithsonian denies he ever existed. There is no S.A. Jordan in the directories of American archaeologists from the early 20th century. Two men, a massive cave, and a prestigious institution, all linked in print, yet disconnected in reality. the Smithsonian's denial has become a central pillar of the mystery. Over the years, the institution has received so many letters inquiring about the Egyptian cave in the Grand Canyon that they developed a standard form letter to respond. It reads, polite but firm. The Smithsonian Institution has never been involved in any such excavations. They state clearly that no Egyptian artifacts of any kind have ever been found in North America. For the mainstream historian, this is the end of the story. The newspaper lied, the men were fictional, and the cave is a fantasy. But for the conspiracy theorist, the denial is exactly what one would expect. If you found something that contradicted the Bible, or the timeline of human evolution, or the manifest destiny of the European settlers, would you publish it, or would you hide it? We have to remember the context of 1909. This was a time when archaeology was deeply tied to national identity. The prevailing theory was that Native Americans were the ancestors of the people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge, and that their development had been entirely separate from the old world of Egypt, Greece, and Mesopotamia. To find an Egyptian temple in Arizona would have smashed that theory to pieces. It would have raised uncomfortable questions about who was really here first. So, the erasure hypothesis goes like this. Kincaid found it, Jordan confirmed it, and the higher-ups in Washington panicked. They ordered the cave sealed. They ordered the artifacts crated up and hidden in the vast, labyrinthine storerooms of the Smithsonian, the same storerooms we saw teased in the final scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark. And they ordered the names of Kincaid and Jordan struck from the record. It sounds implausible, a cinematic plot twist. But bureaucracies are good at losing things. They are good at redefining truth by simply misplacing a file. There is another possibility, one that doesn't require a grand conspiracy, but rather a simple misunderstanding of who Kincaid was. Some researchers have tried to find a real person who fits the description, even if the name was slightly wrong. Was there a Kincaid with a K? Was he a pot hunter, a private treasure seeker who used the Smithsonian's name to give himself legitimacy? In the early 1900s, the Grand Canyon was not the regulated national park it is today. It was a wild frontier. Men roamed the canyons prospecting for copper, gold, and zinc. They dug into the cliffs, dynamited tunnels, and often stumbled upon ancestral Puebloan ruins. It is entirely possible that Kincaid was a prospector who found a real cave, perhaps one filled with split-twig figurines or ancient pottery, and his imagination, or the reporter's imagination, spun it into an Egyptian citadel. Maybe the gold cups were just yellow-painted clay. Maybe the mummies were just desiccated bodies wrapped in yucca fiber, which are real and have been found in the region. But Kincaid's description of the location was very specific. About 42 miles up the river from the El Tovar Crystal Canyon. This puts the site in the Marble Canyon area, a stretch of the river that is incredibly difficult to access. The walls there are sheer limestone, rising straight up from the water. To climb 1,500 feet up those cliffs with photographic equipment and surveying tools, as Kincaid claimed to do, would be a feat of mountaineering, not just a casual hike. And yet, Kincaid vanishes. No death certificate has been definitively linked to him. No grave marks his resting place. He appears in history for one day, points a finger at a hole in the cliff, and then dissolves into the mist. But even if the man was a ghost, the canyon is real, and the canyon is vast. If you have ever stood on the rim, looking out over that endless sea of stone, you know the feeling of insignificance. You know that you could hide a city, an army, or a history in those folds, and it might never be found. The Smithsonian says Kincaid didn't exist. The newspapers stopped asking, but the story didn't stop. It went underground, much like the citadel itself now that we have walked through the dusty archives of Phoenix and chased the ghosts of men who may never have existed. We must turn our attention to the one witness in this story that cannot lie: the Earth itself. When we talk about the Grand Canyon, it is difficult to truly grasp the scale of it from a photograph or a postcard. The numbers, 277 miles long, up to 18 miles wide, and over a mile deep, are just abstract figures. They don't convey the feeling of standing on the rim and looking into a void so vast that it seems to drink the sunlight. It is a landscape that feels less like a feature of the earth and more like a wound in the world, exposing the bone and muscle of the planet. Why is this layer so important? Because limestone is the architect of secrets. Unlike granite or sandstone, limestone is soluble. Over millions of years, slightly acidic rainwater seeps into the cracks of the rock, dissolving it grain by grain, widening fractures into tunnels and tunnels into caverns. This process creates what geologists call karst topography. It is the same geological process that created the Mammoth Caves of Kentucky or the Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. So, when we ask if there could be a massive cave system hidden in the Grand Canyon, the geological answer is not only yes, but almost certainly. The Redwall Limestone is famous for its caves. In fact, many of the known caves in the canyon are found exactly in this layer. Consider the Cave of the Domes on Horseshoe Mesa, or the vast, winding passages of Stanton's Cave, which we will touch on later. These are not small pockets. They are cathedrals of stone, capable of stretching for miles into the dark. The geology supports the idea of a rich cavern. It provides the perfect container for a hidden world. But Kincaid's description adds another layer of complexity. He didn't say the cave was at the water level. He said it was roughly 2,000 feet above the river, hidden on a shelf. This detail is geologically sound. As the Colorado River cut deeper into the earth over the last 5 to 6 million years, the water table dropped. Caves that were once filled with water and actively growing were left high and dry, abandoned by the river that made them. These fossil caves sit high on the canyon walls, their entrances often obscured by rockfalls, brush, or the sheer angle of the cliff. Accessing these high caves is incredibly dangerous. The terrain of the Grand Canyon, especially in the Marble Canyon region where Kincaid allegedly was, is some of the most unforgiving on the planet. The cliffs are vertical. The rock is often loose and rotten, ready to crumble under the weight of a boot. There are no trails here. To reach a cave mouth 2,000 feet up, you would need to be an expert climber, or you would need to know a path that has been lost to memory. This inaccessibility is key to the mystery. Skeptics often ask, if there is a city down there, why hasn't a hiker found it? But the vast majority of the Grand Canyon's 300 miles are virtually untouched by human feet. We stick to the rims, to the established trails, to the river. The vertical world in between, the thousands of square miles of cliff face and side canyons, is a terra incognita, a blank spot on the map right in the middle of America. There is a concept in geology called preservation potential. It asks the question, what survives? On the surface, wind and rain erase everything. A building left on the canyon rim would be dust in a few thousand years. But inside a dry limestone cave, protected from the sun, the rain, and the temperature fluctuations, time stands still. The air is still. The humidity is constant. We know from other discoveries in the region that the canyon caves are incredible preservers. We have found the dung of giant ground sloths, extinct for 11,000 years, that looks as fresh as if it were dropped yesterday. We have found fragile twigs twisted into animal shapes by people living 4,000 years ago, sitting undisturbed on a cave floor. If a civilization did build a city inside one of these caverns, the geology would protect it perfectly. The copper tools Kincaid mentioned wouldn't rust in the dry desert air. The mummies, wrapped in their clay cloth, would not decay. The seeds in the granaries would remain dormant, waiting for water that never comes. The cave acts as a time capsule, sealing the past away in a vacuum of silence. But the geology also offers a warning. The canyon is dynamic. While the caves are stable, the entrances are not. Rock slides are common. Whole sections of cliff face can shear off and crash into the river below, taking the secrets of a cave mouth with them. It is entirely possible that the entrance Kincaid found, if he found it, was open in 1909, but has since been buried by a collapse. The canyon is constantly reshaping itself, hiding and revealing its doors at the whim of gravity. Let's drift deeper into this idea of the forbidden terrain. The specific area Kincaid described near the confluence of the Little Colorado River is a place of profound geological power. The Hopi call it the Sipapuni, the place of emergence. To the geologist, it is a place where the Earth's crust is twisted and folded. The rock layers here are not just flat. They are warped by ancient tectonic pressures. This warping creates fractures, and fractures create pathways for water, which creates caves. It is a perfect storm of geological conditions for a massive underground system. You have the right type of rock, limestone, the right history of water flow, and the right tectonic fracturing. If you were a writer trying to invent a location for a secret underground city, you couldn't choose a better spot than the Redwall Limestone of Marble Canyon. It is scientifically plausible, even if the city itself seems fantastic. And there is another geological factor: the acoustics. Kincaid mentioned that the cave radiated out like a wheel, with a main hall and passages. This structure mirrors the natural formation of some limestone solution caves, where water follows intersecting fracture lines. But it also suggests something else: the manipulation of natural spaces. Ancient cultures all over the world have used the acoustic properties of caves for ritual. The way sound carries in the dark, the way a single drum beat can echo like thunder, it feels supernatural. If the builders Kincaid described were real, they didn't just choose a hole in the wall. They chose a geological instrument. They chose a space where the earth itself amplified their prayers or their commands. So, As we stand mentally on the edge of that precipice, looking down at the winding ribbon of the Colorado River, we have to respect the stone. The Grand Canyon is not just a view, it is a fortress. It has the walls, the hidden chambers, and the daunting scale to keep a secret. The idea that we have mapped every inch of it is an illusion. We have mapped the shape of it from satellites, yes, but we have not knocked on every door. We have not shone a light into every crack in the Redwall. The geology tells us that there are empty spaces down there, dark and silent, waiting. Whether those spaces are filled with natural stalactites or the statues of forgotten gods is a different question. But the stage, the physical, geological stage, is built and ready. The Redwall Limestone stands like a curtain, heavy and red, drawn across the entrance to the underworld. Kincaid claimed he pulled that curtain back. He claimed he found a geology that had been tamed by engineering. He described tunnels that followed the veins of the rock, ventilation shafts that used the natural drafts of the cliff. He described a marriage of stone and mind. In the next part, we will leave the rock behind and pick up the artifacts themselves. We will examine the strange, impossible inventory that Kincaid brought back, or claimed to bring back from the dark. Why Egyptian? Why Oriental? And what do these descriptions tell us, not about the ancient past, but about the world of 1909? The geology makes the cave possible, but it is the contents of the cave that make it dangerous. Let's turn the lantern light onto the gold, the copper, and the silent, gray-eyed faces of the dead. If the geology of the Grand Canyon provides the stage, then the artifacts G.E. Kincaid described are the actors that turn a landscape into a mystery. And what a strange cast of characters they are. When we read the 1909 Gazette article, we are not presented with the expected tools of the American Southwest. No flint arrowheads, no woven baskets, no turquoise beads. Instead, we are confronted with a collection of objects that feel like they have been teleported from the other side of the world. Kincaid's inventory is a collision of cultures, a surreal blend of the Nile and the Ganges hidden in the Arizona desert. He speaks of a great idol that resembles Buddha, yet holding lotus flowers in a way that suggests something else. He speaks of hieroglyphics, writing on the walls and on urns, that he specifically compares to those found in Egypt. He describes copper tools, hardened by a lost process, and granaries filled with seeds. Why these specific items? To understand the artifacts, we have to drift back into the mind of the early 20th century. We have to understand the lens through which Kincaid and the reading public saw the world. In 1909, the world was in the grip of Egyptomania. The mysteries of the pharaohs were the peak of romance and intrigue. Although King Tut's tomb wouldn't be opened for another 13 years, the Victorians and Edwardians were obsessed with the idea of the Nile. Egypt represented the oldest wisdom, the deepest magic, and the root of all civilization. If you wanted to describe something as ancient, profound, and mysterious, you compared it to Egypt. Simultaneously, there was a fascination with the Orient, a broad, often vague term used by Westerners to encompass everything from India to Tibet to China. Tibet, in particular, was the Forbidden Kingdom, the land of lamas and hidden monasteries in the Himalayas, high and inaccessible, much like the cliffs of the Grand Canyon. So, when Kincaid describes a Buddha-like statue sitting cross-legged with lotus flowers, he is tapping into the two most potent symbols of mystery available to his era. He is weaving a tapestry that connects the American West to the mystical East. But let's look closer at the description of this idol. Kincaid says, "The cast of the face is oriental," but he also notes the carvings around it are crooked, meant to represent evil, while others are beautiful, representing good. This duality, light and dark, good and evil, is universal, but the specific imagery of the lotus is key. In Buddhism and Hinduism, the lotus represents purity rising from the mud, enlightenment emerging from the darkness. Finding such a symbol in a cave in North America would imply a hyperdiffusionist connection. Hyperdiffusionism was a popular theory in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was the idea that all great civilizations sprang from a single source, maybe Atlantis, maybe Egypt, maybe Mu, and spread out across the globe. Proponents like Ignatius Donnelly argued that the similarities between pyramids in Egypt and pyramids in Mexico proved they were connected. Kincaid's discovery was practically a checklist for this theory. It had the mummies, Egypt, the lotus, India, Tibet, and the location, America. It was as if the cave was designed to answer the biggest questions of 1909 anthropology with a resounding yes, it's all connected. Let's touch on the metal. Kincaid claimed to find copper instruments as hard as steel. This is a detail that adds a layer of technological mystery. Native Americans in the region, specifically the ancestors of the Puebloans, did not smelt copper for tools. They used stone, bone, and wood. To find hardened, smelted copper weaponry implies a metallurgy far beyond what was historically present. It implies an industrial capacity, furnaces, bellows, mining operations on a massive scale. And then there are the granaries. Kincaid described immense round silos filled with seeds. This is perhaps the most grounded part of his claim. The ancestral Puebloans did store grain in sealed stone granaries to protect it from rodents and moisture. We see these all over the Southwest. But Kincaid scales it up. He isn't describing a family's winter supply. He is describing a reserve for a city of 50,000. He claims the granaries were located high up in the cave, near the ventilation shafts, showing an understanding of air circulation to prevent rot. But the most haunting artifacts are the mummies. Kincaid describes a crypt with tiers of stone shelves, each holding a body. He says, the mummies were all male, no women or children. This detail changes the nature of the site. It suggests this wasn't a city in the normal sense, with families and daily life. It was a fortress, a monastery, or a barracks. He notes that the mummies were wrapped in a clay roll or bark fabric. This is distinct from Egyptian linen. It sounds more like a localized adaptation, using the materials of the desert to mimic the rituals of the Nile. Kincaid also mentions that some of the mummies were placed in deeper, darker recesses, implying a hierarchy or a caste system. Why did he specifically mention gray eyes? This is a classic trope of the lost race literature of the time. The idea of a white or light-eyed race existing in the Americas before the current indigenous tribes was a common theme in adventure novels and pseudo-history. It was a narrative that appealed to the colonial mindset, the idea that people like us were here first. It is a problematic and dated perspective, but it is essential to understanding the texture of the story. The artifacts of Kincaid's cave are almost too perfect. They fit the desires of 1909 too well. They confirm the biases and the romantic dreams of the era. But does that make them fiction? Or does it mean that Kincaid described real things using the only vocabulary he had? Maybe the Buddha was actually a figure from indigenous mythology that Kincaid simply misidentified. The Hopi and Zuni have complex pantheons of kachinas and deities. Could a large, cross-legged figure of a kachina look like a Buddha to a white explorer who had never seen one before? Maybe the hieroglyphics were actually complex petroglyphs. The spiral and geometric narratives that adorn canyon walls all over the Southwest. If Kincaid saw a density of them he had never encountered, he might have reached for the word hieroglyphics to convey their complexity. And maybe the mummies were simply the desiccated remains of ancestors, placed with care in a dry cave, which is a known practice. The clay wrapping could have been a misinterpretation of dust-caked blankets or yucca mats. But the sheer volume is what sets it apart. The copper swords, the gold cups, the layout of the streets. These don't fit the archaeological record of the Southwest. These belong to the world of the Arabian Nights or King Solomon's mines. These artifacts, real or imagined, serve as echoes of the Orient. They are the ghosts of a global civilization that may never have existed, projected onto the blank canvas of the canyon walls. They ask us to imagine a time when the Colorado River was a highway for ships bearing the lotus and the scarab. A time when the desert was a colony of the ancient world. It is a seductive image. It pulls at the imagination. It makes you want to believe that there is a warehouse in Washington, D.C., where a crate stamped Grand Canyon 1909 sits unopened, holding a copper sword that shouldn't exist. But as we drift away from the gold and the idols, we have to listen to a different set of voices. While Kincaid was looking for Egypt in the rocks, the people who actually lived there, the Hopi, the Navajo, the Paiute, already had names for the underworld. They didn't need to import mystery from the Nile. They had their own stories, stories that strangely echo some of Kincaid's wildest claims, but from a perspective that is entirely American. In the next part, we will leave the perspective of the white explorer and sit with the legends of the Hopi. We will descend into the Sipapuni. We have spent a great deal of time looking at the Grand Canyon through the eyes of a man who may have been a ghost. We have examined his copper tools, his Egyptian statues, and his impossible mummies. But in doing so, we have perhaps made the oldest mistake in the history of exploration. We have assumed that the silence of the canyon means it was empty until a white man stumbled upon it. But the canyon has never been empty, and it has never been silent. For thousands of years, long before G.E. Kincaid floated down the Colorado River in his wooden boat, the canyon was home, cathedral, and graveyard to the indigenous people of the Southwest. And when you stop reading the newspapers of 1909 and start listening to the elders of the Hopi tribe, the story of an underground city stops sounding like a hoax and starts sounding like a memory. To the Hopi, who live on the high, arid mesas to the east of the canyon, the Grand Canyon is not just a geological curiosity. It is the womb of the world. It is the place of their beginning. Their creation story does not start in a garden, nor does it start with a descent from the stars. It starts in the dark. It starts deep underground. The Hopi believe that this world we live in now, the fourth world, is just the latest in a succession of realities. The previous worlds, the first, second, and third, were destroyed when the people lost their way, when they forgot their spiritual connection to the Creator and fell into chaos and war. Each time a world ended, the faithful, the peaceful ones, were saved. And how were they saved? They were taken underground. This is where the legend intersects violently with the geography of our mystery. The Hopi believe that their ancestors emerged into this current world through a specific location in the Grand Canyon called the Sipapuni. It is a real place. If you travel to the confluence of the Little Colorado and the Colorado Rivers, the very same area where Kincaid claimed to find his cave, you will find a mound of mineral deposits, a travertine dome bubbling with a spring. To the casual hiker, it is a geological feature. To the Hopi, it is the doorway to the underworld. But the most fascinating part of Hopi lore, the part that sends a shiver down the spine of anyone searching for lost civilizations, is the legend of the Anusinom, the Ant People. The story goes that during the destruction of the First World, which was destroyed by fire, perhaps a memory of ancient volcanic activity or a coronal mass ejection, the Creator guided the Hopi ancestors to the Ant People. These beings lived in vast subterranean caves. They were described as generous and industrious. They took the Hopi in, shared their food, and taught them how to survive in the dark. The description of the Ant People is hauntingly specific. In the legends, they are portrayed as having thin waists, large heads, and spindly limbs. They were not monsters. They were saviors. They had a complex society underground, with storage rooms for food, ventilation systems, and a communal life that prioritized the group over the individual. Does this sound familiar? Kincaid described a citadel with radiating tunnels, massive granaries for food storage, and a layout that resembled a barracks or a communal hive. He described mummies that were all male, perhaps a warrior or worker caste. He described a ventilation system that kept the air fresh deep within the rock. Is it possible that G.E. Kincaid, intentionally or accidentally, stumbled upon the physical reality behind the Hopi myth? Or, conversely, did he craft his hoax by borrowing from these legends? The details align so perfectly that it is hard to dismiss them as coincidence. The Hopi word for ant is anu. The word for friend is naki. Some linguistic researchers, though this is speculative and sits on the fringe, have pointed out the similarity to the Sumerian Anunnaki, the sky gods. While the connection spans continents and seems impossible, the coincidence of sound is striking. But we don't need to look to Sumeria to find the wonder. The Hopi legend stands on its own. Consider the kiva. The kiva is the ceremonial chambers of the Puebloan peoples. It is a round room, built partially or entirely underground. You enter it from a hole in the roof, climbing down a ladder into the cool, dim interior. In the center of the floor there is a small hole, the sipapu, representing the portal to the underworld. Every time a Hopi priest descends into a kiva, he is reenacting the time when his ancestors lived with the ant people. he is remembering the safety of the earth. The architecture of their most sacred space is a map of the underground refuge. If the Hopi spent generations living in subterranean caves to survive a surface cataclysm, maybe the end of the last ice age, maybe a solar event, then the city Kincaid found might not be Egyptian at all. It might be the ancestral shelter of the Hopi, the Ant Kiva, on a massive scale. The granaries Kincaid saw, they were the stores that kept humanity alive while the surface burned. The Buddha statue, perhaps a representation of Sotuknang, the sky deity, or Masaowu, the guardian of the underworld. The hieroglyphics, the complex pictographs that tell the story of the migrations. When you view the Kincaid story through the Hopi lens, the Oriental exoticism falls away, and something more grounded but equally spectacular emerges. It suggests that the Grand Canyon hides the physical evidence of a lost chapter in human survival. It suggests that the myth of the hollow earth, or at least the habitable earth, is based on a historical trauma, a time when the surface was uninhabitable, and humanity had to become subterranean to survive. The Hopi say that the ant people are still there, deep down, watching. They say that the Sipapuni is not a closed door, but a resting one. The spirits travel back and forth. The wind that howls through the gorge is the breath of the ancestors. And the Hopi are not alone in this belief. As we move around the rim of the canyon, from the mesas of the Hopi to the lands of the Paiute and the Navajo, we find that the canyon is crowded with entities. It is not just a geological void. It is a neighborhood of gods, monsters, and hidden races. The Hopi connection gives the underground city a moral weight. It isn't just a treasure trove of gold and copper, it is a sanctuary. It brings up the idea that civilization is cyclical, just like the worlds the Hopi describe. We rise, we fall, we go underground, we emerge, and we forget. Kincaid's tragedy, or his crime, was trying to force this indigenous memory into a Western box. He saw a lotus where he should have seen a squash blossom. He saw Egypt where he should have seen the Fourth World. But the core of the claim, that there is a massive, structured, inhabited space inside the cliffs, is not something he invented. It is something the Hopi have been singing about in their kivas for 1,000 years. But the Hopi are the peaceful people. Their stories are about survival and emergence. If we travel west to the lands of the Paiute, the stories change. They become stranger. They talk not just of survival, but of technology. They talk of a people who didn't just hide in the caves, but who built machines in them. In the next part, we will meet the Hav-Musuvs. And if you thought the ant people were strange, wait until you hear about the silver canoes that fly without wings, hidden deep in the Panamint Mountains, just a stone's throw from the canyon's edge. The indigenous voice is not a monolith. It is a chorus. And some of the songs sound disturbingly like science fiction. As we leave the sacred mesas of the Hopi and travel westward across the rugged basin and range country, the tone of the legends shifts. The Hopi speak of the underground with reverence, as a womb, a place of ancestral safety. But the Paiute, who roamed the deserts of Nevada, Utah, and Arizona, tell a story that feels sharper, more metallic, and unsettlingly modern. deep in the oral traditions of the Paiute people, specifically those recorded in the Panamint Valley region near Death Valley, which is geographically linked to the Greater Canyon system, there lies the legend of the Have-Musuvs. This is not a story you will find in standard history textbooks, but it was recorded by a man named Ogamake, a Navajo storyteller who related the Paiute tradition to a researcher in the 1940s. The story goes like this. Long ago, the desert was not a desert. It was a lush, water-filled land. The Panamint Valley was a great lake. The people who lived there, the Have-Musuvs, were a mighty maritime nation. They built great boats and traded across the water. But then the climate shifted. The rains stopped. The lakes dried up. The green world turned to brown, and the water receded into the earth. Most people would have moved on or died out. But the Have-Musuvs were clever. They did not leave. Instead, they followed the water. They moved into the vast caverns of the Panamint Mountains and the deep fissures of the earth. And there, in the dark, they didn't just survive. They evolved. The Paiute legends describe the Have-Musuvs as a people who possess high technology. They are said to wear clothes woven from a material like spun gold, reminding us instantly of Kincaid's clay roll, or bark fabric that looked woven. They are described as having fair skin and living in great underground cities lit by a light that is not fire, a pale, greenish glow that never burns out. But the most striking detail, the one that makes modern ufologists and ancient astronaut theorists lean in, is the description of their transport. The Paiute say that the Have-Musuvs pilot silver canoes. But these canoes do not float on water. They fly. They move through the air with a humming sound, maneuvering through the twisting canyons with impossible speed. They have no wings, and they shine like polished metal. Imagine a Paiute hunter, standing on a ridge in the 1800s, looking down into a box canyon and seeing a silver, cigar-shaped object drift silently out of a cave mouth and shoot into the sky. How would he describe it? A silver canoe is a perfect metaphor for a metallic craft. The legend tells of a Paiute chief who lost his wife. In his grief, he wandered deep into the forbidden caves, seeking death. Instead, he found the Have-Musuvs. They took him in. He saw their city, a place of wonders where the air was cool and sweet. He saw their weapons, tubes that could stun an animal or a man from a distance without a projectile. This echoes Kincaid's claim of copper instruments that were essentially high-tech weaponry. The Have-Musuvs told the chief that they watched the surface people but rarely interacted with them. They were waiting. They had retreated from the sun, but they had not lost their power. This Paiute lore aligns disturbingly well with the Kincaid narrative. Both speak of a sophisticated civilization hidden in the cavern systems of the Southwest. Both describe advanced metallurgy or materials, copper steel versus silver canoes. Both imply a race that is distinct from the current indigenous tribes. The Have-Musuvs with their fair skin and the Kincaid mummies with their gray eyes. It is easy to dismiss Kincaid as a liar. It is much harder to dismiss a Paiute tradition that predates Kincaid by centuries. Were they describing the same thing? Did Kincaid stumble upon a Have-Musuv outpost? Or is the underground city a universal archetype in this region because the landscape itself, with its hollowing winds and vanishing rivers, demands it? Then we have the Navajo, or the Dine. Their relationship with the Grand Canyon is complicated. While the Hopi view it as a place of emergence, the Navajo view the deeper recesses of the canyon with a mixture of profound respect and fear. To traditional Navajo, the canyon is a place of powerful spirits. It is a place where the veil between worlds is thin. There are taboos against entering certain ruins or caves. The Chindi, ghosts or spirits left behind by the dead, are a real danger in Navajo belief. Entering a burial site, like the crypt Kincaid described, would be spiritually catastrophic. It invites sickness and misfortune. This cultural boundary might explain why the city remained hidden for so long. The people who knew the terrain best were the ones least likely to disturb the dead. The Navajo also tell of the skinwalkers, or Yi Nald Lushi, witches who can shapeshift. These dark practitioners are often associated with the desolate, rocky places, the caves, and the cliffs. While not a direct parallel to a lost civilization, this lore creates a psychic fence around the canyon depths. It marks the territory as forbidden. When you combine the Hopi Sipapuni, the Paiute Havmusuvs, and the Navajo Chindi, you get a map of the Grand Canyon that is very different from the National Park Service map. It is a map of no trespassing zones. It is a map that says, there are things down here that do not belong to you. G.E. Kincaid, if he existed, was a trespasser. He crossed the psychic fence. He climbed into the Havmusuv city, he walked among the Chindi, he peered into the Sipapuni, and the result was that he vanished. Maybe the Smithsonian conspiracy wasn't a bureaucratic cover-up. Maybe it was a modern interpretation of a much older rule. You do not take things from the underworld and expect to tell the tale. The indigenous stories ground the mystery in the land. They strip away the Egyptian fantasy and replace it with something native and deep. They tell us that the idea of an underground civilization isn't a 20th century invention. It is the oldest truth of the canyon. The Paiute explicitly link the drying of the land to the retreat underground. This is a crucial climatological clue. We know the Southwest was once wetter. We know civilizations like the ancestral Puebloans collapsed due to megadroughts. The idea of moving into caves, where water condenses and temperature is stable, is a logical survival strategy. The myth is simply the history of that survival, elevated into legend over thousands of years. But what if the silver canoes are not metaphors? What if the tubes that stun are not magic? In modern times, the Grand Canyon is a hotspot for UFO sightings. Hikers report strange lights dipping below the rim. Pilots report instruments going haywire near certain mesas. Could the Paiute be describing the same phenomenon we see today? Are the Havmusuvs the cryptoterrestrials, the hidden inhabitants of our own planet that we mistake for aliens? The lore suggests that the canyon is not just a geological formation, but a habitat. And we are the surface dwellers, oblivious to the buzzing of the hive beneath our feet. In the next part, we will leave the realm of myth and return, though, to the realm of men, specifically the men who named the canyon. Why is there a Tower of Ra? Why is there an Isis temple? Did the early explorers know something we don't? Or was their choice of names a subconscious slip that fueled a century of conspiracy? We will look at Clarence Dutton and the naming of the gods. If you open a topographical map of the Grand Canyon today, or if you simply scroll through the satellite view on your phone, you will notice something peculiar. You will see names that do not belong in the American West. You are in Arizona, a land of cowboys, miners, and indigenous tribes. Yet the map reads like a tour of the ancient world. You will find the Tower of Ra. You will find the Isis Temple. You will find the Cheops Pyramid. Drift a little further, and you enter the Hindu pantheon. The Vishnu Temple, the Shiva Temple, the Brahma Temple. There is a Zoroaster temple named for the Persian prophet, and a Wotan's throne for the Norse god. For the casual tourist, these names are just poetic labels attached to impressive rocks. But for the conspiracy theorist, and for those hunting for G.E. Kincaid's Lost City, these names are not just labels. They are clues. Why, they ask, would the government name these massive formations after Egyptian and Hindu gods if there wasn't a connection? Is it a coincidence that Kincaid claimed to find an Egyptian citadel in the shadow of a rock named the Tower of Ra? Or is the map itself a confession? A subtle nod to the truth that the surveyors found but couldn't publicly admit. To understand this, we have to travel back to the 1880s, and we have to meet the man who named the gods, Clarence Dutton. Clarence Dutton was a protege of John Wesley Powell, the famous one-armed explorer who first conquered the Colorado River. But Dutton was not just a geologist, he was a poet in a scientist's coat. He served as an officer in the Civil War, and like many men who have seen the ugliness of human conflict, he found a profound spiritual peace in the slow, violent beauty of geology. When Dutton surveyed the canyon for the U.S. Geological Survey, he didn't just see rock layers. He saw architecture. He saw colossal structures that dwarfed the cathedrals of Europe. In his seminal work, The Tertiary History of the Grand Canyon District, published in 1882, Dutton struggled to find words to describe the sheer alien majesty of the landscape. The Great Unknown, as the canyon was called, didn't look like the green hills of the East Coast. It looked like ruins. The mesas, eroded by wind and water, stood isolated in the vast void like giant temples built by titans. Dutton needed a vocabulary to match this grandeur. He couldn't name these formations Smith's Rock or Big Red Hill. It would have been an insult to the geology. So he looked to the most grandiose architecture he knew, the temples of the Orient and the pyramids of Egypt. This was the late 19th century, the height of the Romantic era and the obsession with Orientalism. To the educated Western mind of 1880, the East, India, Egypt, Persia, represented the sublime, the mystical, and the monumental. By naming a peak the Shiva Temple, Dutton wasn't suggesting that Hindus had built it. He was suggesting that the rock itself evoked the same awe and terror as the destroyer god of the Hindu Trinity. He was trying to elevate the American landscape to the level of world mythology. It was an aesthetic choice, a literary flourish. And it was successful. Dutton's prose defined how we see the canyon today, but he accidentally planted a seed of confusion that would grow for a century. By painting the map with the names of Ra, Isis, and Horus, he primed the psychological landscape for Kincaid. Think about it. 27 years after Dutton names a peak the Tower of Ra, G.E. Kincaid walks out of the canyon claiming to have found an Egyptian temple. Did Kincaid find a temple? Or was he walking through a landscape that had already been culturally coded as Egyptian by Clarence Dutton? If the peaks had been named Granite Bluff and Red Spire, would Kincaid have hallucinated a Buddha, or would he have seen something else? Names have power. They shape what we see. When you hike the canyon trails today, and you look up at the Isis temple, the name acts like a filter on your vision. You start to see the terracing of the sedimentary rock as the steps of a ziggurat. You start to see the natural erosion as carved masonry. The map tells you this is a temple, and your brain tries to make it true. This is called pareidolia, the tendency to see meaningful patterns in random noise, but boosted by the power of suggestion. However, the conspiracy theorists argue the reverse. They argue that Dutton didn't choose these names out of poetic license. They suggest that Dutton, as a high-ranking member of the scientific establishment, saw the ruins himself. They claim that the naming convention was a way of hiding in plain sight. By naming a natural formation Isis Temple, you give yourself an excuse if someone later finds an actual temple of Isis nearby. "Oh, that?" the government could say. "That's just the name we gave the rock." It is a clever, if unlikely, theory. It turns the map into a treasure hunt. And it is true that many of these formations are strictly off-limits to climbers and hikers. The terrain around the Tower of Ra and the Horus Temple is dangerously steep and crumbly. Very few humans have ever stood on their summits or explored their bases. The isolation of these temples preserves their mystery. You can look at them from the rim miles away through binoculars, but you cannot touch them. This distance allows the imagination to run wild. Are there caves at the base of the Cheops Pyramid? Is there an entrance hidden in the shadow of Vishnu? Dutton's choice of names also reflects a specific 19th century worldview. The idea that America needed its own ancient history. Europe had Rome and Greece. Egypt had the pharaohs. What did America have? It had the canyon. By assigning these grand, ancient names to the geology, men like Dutton and Powell were constructing a mythology for the young nation. They were saying, our ruins were built by God, and they are older and grander than anything you have in the old world. But this nationalistic myth-making collided with the Kincaid story in a strange way. Kincaid's story took the metaphor literally. He said, "No, it's not just a metaphor. They were actually here." And this brings us to the most restricted areas of the canyon. There are rumors, persistent, unverified, but stubborn, that specific areas around these named formations are no-fly zones. That hikers who attempt to bushwhack to the base of the Isis temple are turned back by park rangers or meet with accidents. These are likely just campfire stories born of the dangerous terrain. But the correlation remains. The area where Kincaid claimed to find his cave is in the vicinity of these named monuments. He didn't claim to find it in the western end of the canyon, where the names are more indigenous or descriptive, like Supai or Havasupai. He found it right in the heart of the oriental section. Did Dutton know? Did Powell know? Were the names a code, a joke, or a prophecy? We may never know what was in Clarence Dutton's mind when he looked at a slab of red limestone and decided to call it the throne of Odin. But we know what effect it had. It transformed the Grand Canyon from a geological trench into a sacred geography. It turned the landscape into a book of myths. And once you turn a landscape into a myth, you invite people to search for monsters and treasures within it. Kincaid was just the first to take the map literally, but he wouldn't be the last. Even today, people scan Google Earth looking for anomalies near the Tower of Ra, convinced that the name marks the spot. It is a testament to the power of words. Dutton wrote poetry in stone, and a century later, people are still trying to excavate it. But before Dutton, there was Powell. And if Dutton was the poet who named the surface, Powell was the soldier who conquered the depths. The mystery of the Grand Canyon's forbidden history cannot be told without looking at the first expedition of 1869. Because there are holes in that story, too. Missing journals, missing men, and a silence that fell over the scientific record right at the moment when the first boots touched the canyon floor. In the next part, we will ride the rapids with the one-armed major. We will ask what really happened to the 3 men who walked out of the canyon and were never seen again. And we will ask if John Wesley Powell saw things in the dark that he decided the world was not yet ready to know. History is written by the victors, they say. But in the case of exploration, history is written by the survivors. And in the summer of 1869, survival was the only thing on the mind of John Wesley Powell. Powell is a titan of American history, a one-armed Civil War veteran, a self-taught scientist, and the man who would go on to found the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian. He was a man of iron will and rigid rationality. But his journey down the Colorado River was a descent into madness. It was the first time white men had attempted to navigate the entire length of the Grand Canyon. They had 4 wooden boats, primitive supplies, and no map. To them, the canyon was not a park. It was the great unknown, a blank space on the map labeled only with warnings of waterfalls and subterranean passages. The expedition is famous for its hardships. The boats were smashed against rocks, the food spoiled. The men were starving, sun-baked, and terrified. The roar of the rapids was a constant, deafening presence, amplifying the psychological strain. But there is a shadow hanging over the Powell expedition, a shadow that connects directly to our mystery of forbidden history. It concerns the fate of 3 men, O.G. Howland, his brother Seneca Howland, and William Dunn. Near the end of the journey, at a place now called Separation Rapid, these 3 men had had enough. They believed the river was a suicide mission. They refused to go further. Powell, ever the commander, tried to convince them to stay, but they were resolute. They took some supplies, climbed out of the canyon, and walked up toward the Shivwitz Plateau. They were never seen alive again. Powell and the remaining crew survived the rapid and emerged from the canyon just days later. The official story, recorded by Powell, is that the 3 men were killed by Shivwitz warriors, who mistook them for miners who had murdered a native woman. It was a tragic case of mistaken identity, but over the years, historians and conspiracy theorists have picked at this scab. Why were the bodies never recovered? Why did the Shivwitz deny the killing to later researchers, claiming the men were actually killed by Mormons or other white settlers? And, most importantly for our story, what did they take with them? It is rumored that Dunn and the Howland brothers carried journals and notes with them when they climbed out. Notes that might have contained observations differing from Powell's official log. Some theorists speculate that the three men saw something in the canyon. Ruins, caves, artifacts that Powell wanted to suppress or that caused a rift in the group. Did they find the entrance to the underworld? Did they find evidence of a civilization that didn't fit the scientific narrative Powell was trying to construct? This is speculation, of course, but we must understand Powell's ideology. Powell was a strict evolutionist in the anthropological sense. He believed in unilinear evolution, the idea that all societies progress from savagery to barbarism to civilization. To Powell, the Native Americans were in the stage of savagery or barbarism. This wasn't just racism. It was the scientific dogma of the day. If Powell had stumbled upon a massive, sophisticated Egyptian-style citadel in the canyon, it would have shattered his entire worldview. It would have meant that savagery was not the starting point, but perhaps the remnant of a fallen civilization. It would have turned his scientific ladder upside down. Would a man like Powell, whose career depended on establishing a specific scientific order, have reported an anomaly that destroyed his theories? Or would he have ignored it? Or silenced it? The Smithsonian, which Powell helped shape, became the gatekeeper of American prehistory. The Powell Doctrine largely defined how indigenous ruins were interpreted for decades. They were simple, relatively recent, and unconnected to the Old World. Any evidence to the contrary, giants, metal tools, foreign scripts, was aggressively debunked or filed away as a hoax. This creates a fertile ground for suspicion. The Kincaid story of 1909 appeared just 7 years after Powell's death. It emerged in a vacuum of authority. But the seeds of the cover-up, if there is one, would have been planted by Powell himself. There is also the matter of the lost notes. Powell's published account of the expedition, the exploration of the Colorado River of the West, was written years after the fact. It is a gripping adventure story, but historians have noted discrepancies between his book and the raw journals of the other crew members. He embellished. He combined events. He edited the timeline for dramatic effect. If he was willing to edit the geography of the river for a better story, would he be willing to edit out a cave? The canyon does strange things to the mind. The sensory deprivation, the heat, the constant verticality. It induces a state of altered consciousness. The men saw things in the rock. Faces. Castles. Powell himself describes the canyon walls as libraries of the gods. But was it just poetry? There is a story, often whispered but rarely printed, that one of the survivors of the expedition spoke of stone houses high in the cliffs that were inaccessible and looked wrong for the region. Not the mud-brick cliff dwellings of the Puebloans, but masonry of cut stone. This rumor drifts in the same current as the Kincaid story. It suggests that the first eyes to see the canyon from the bottom up saw more than they told the Bureau of Ethnology. The death of Dunn and the Howlands remains the great tragedy of the canyon. A plaque at Separation Rapid commemorates them. But their silence is absolute. Whatever they knew, whatever they saw on their climb out to the rim, died with them on the Shivwitz Plateau. And Powell, the survivor, became the architect of history. He drew the maps. He named the rocks. He defined the truth. And in Powell's truth, there were no Egyptians in Arizona. There were no underground cities. There was only the slow, grinding work of erosion and the simple lives of the savages he studied. But geology has a way of revealing what men try to hide. Decades later, real archaeologists, not phantoms like Kincaid, would start finding things in the canyon that didn't fit Powell's simple narrative. They wouldn't find gold statues, but they would find split-twig figurines. They would find evidence of humans venturing deep into the most inaccessible caves for rituals that we still don't understand. In the next part, we will move from the conspiracy of the missing men to the hard evidence of the split-twig enigma. We will look at what science has actually found in the caves of the Grand Canyon. And we will see that the truth, while less golden than Kincaid's city, is ancient and mysterious in its own right. The canyon was indeed a holy place, a forbidden zone, thousands of years before the first newspaper was printed in Phoenix. The evidence is made of willow, and it is hidden in the dark. We have talked about golden idols, copper swords, and mummies wrapped in clay. These are the treasures of the imagination, the kinds of things that fill movie screens and paperback novels. But now, I want you to clear that image from your mind. I want you to picture something much smaller, much simpler, and yet, in its own way, infinitely more mysterious. Picture a single willow branch, split down the middle, and carefully twisted by human fingers into the shape of an animal. A deer, perhaps, or a bighorn sheep. It is no bigger than your hand. It has no gold, no jewels, no writing. But unlike Kincaid's citadel, these little figures are real. And they prove that thousands of years ago, people were indeed venturing into the most terrifying depths of the Grand Canyon to do something secret in the dark. This is the mystery of the split-twig figurines. It began in 1933, decades after Kincaid's alleged discovery. 3 men were exploring a cave in the Redwall Limestone, the same geological layer Kincaid described, located in a side canyon called Sycamore Canyon. The cave was difficult to reach, requiring a steep climb and a squeeze through a narrow opening. Inside, sealed away from the sun and the wind, they found 3 small wooden figures hidden under a rock cairn. At first, archaeologists didn't know what to make of them. They looked almost like children's toys, discarded and forgotten. But as more were found in other caves, Stanton's Cave, An Kaitan Cave, White Cave, a pattern emerged. These weren't toys. They were ritual objects, and they were incredibly old. Carbon dating would eventually place them between 3,000 and 4,000 years old. This places their creators in the Archaic period, long before the ancestral Puebloans built their cliff dwellings, long before the Navajo or Paiute arrived in the region. These were the works of the desert culture, hunter-gatherers, a people who moved across the landscape, leaving very little behind. But what makes the figurines truly baffling is where they were found. They were not found in living quarters. There were no signs of fire pits, no food scraps, no bedding in these caves. These were not homes. They were found in the most inaccessible, dangerous, and remote caverns of the canyon. To place a figurine in one of these caves, an ancient hunter would have to climb hundreds of feet up a sheer cliff, squeeze through a tight aperture, and venture into absolute darkness with nothing but a torch. Why? Why risk your life to hide a wooden deer in a hole in the wall? The leading theory is sympathetic magic. Many of the figurines were found pierced with small cactus spines or spears made of wood. This suggests a ritual. Before a hunt, the shaman or the hunter would go into the womb of the earth, create an effigy of the prey, and kill it ritually to ensure success in the waking world. It is a practice as old as the cave paintings in Lascaux. But in the context of the Grand Canyon mysteries, the split-twig figurines tell us something crucial. They tell us that the canyon depths were considered a spiritual zone, a place of magic. They tell us that the ancients did not fear the underground. They sought it out. They believed that the power to control life and death resided in the dark places of the Redwall Limestone. Now, compare this to Kincaid's story. Kincaid claimed to find a massive shrine or temple. While a giant Buddha is a far cry from a willow deer, the fundamental impulse is the same: the use of deep caverns for sacred purposes. If archaic hunters were using these caves 4,000 years ago, and if the ancestral Puebloans used kivas to mimic caves 1,000 years ago, is it so impossible to imagine a culture in between expanding on that idea? The discovery of the figurines also proved that the Redwall caves are capable of preserving organic material for millennia. The figurines are made of wood and bark, materials that should have rotted away centuries ago, yet they look fresh. This validates the preservation potential we discussed earlier. If there were mummies, or clothes, or seeds in a sealed cave, they would survive. The science supports the possibility of preservation, even if it doesn't support the specific artifacts Kincaid described. But there is another connection. Some of these figurines were found in caves that are incredibly difficult to find even with modern maps. Stanton's cave, for example, is a massive chamber that extends deep into the cliff. When archaeologists excavated it, they found layers of history going back tens of thousands of years. Not just human history, but the bones of ancient condors and mountain goats. It proves that the canyon has been a shelter for life for eons. The sheer number of caves in the Grand Canyon is estimated to be around 1,000. Of those, only a few hundred have been documented. And of those, only a handful have been thoroughly excavated. The split-twig figurines were missed by explorers for decades, simply because they were small and hidden under rocks. What else is hidden under the rocks? The figurines are a silent technology. They don't scream of industry or metallurgy. They speak of a quiet, desperate relationship with the harsh environment. But they also serve as a warning to skeptics. Until 1933, the idea that ancient people climbed sheer cliffs to perform magic rituals in caves was unknown. It wasn't in the textbooks. If you had suggested it in 1900, you might have been laughed at. Why would they climb up there? There's no water, no food. Yet they did. The evidence was there all along, waiting for the right person to shine a flashlight on it. This is the lesson of the split-twig enigma. The canyon is full of behavior that doesn't make logical sense to a modern observer. It is a landscape of ritual, not just utility. And if the archaic people could hide their sacred objects so well that they stayed lost for 40 centuries, what could a more advanced, more determined civilization hide? The figurines are the smoking gun of the underground, not of a city, but of a presence. They prove that the forbidden zone was breached, repeatedly and intentionally, by humans. And they prove that the Redwall Limestone is a vault. Kincaid's story may be a distortion, a hallucination, or a lie. But the stage he set, the cave high in the wall, the dry air, the sacred purpose, is accurate. He got the setting right, even if the props were all wrong. But there is one prop in Kincaid's story that refuses to stay small. It isn't a willow deer, it is a giant. Kincaid claimed the mummies were of a giant race, and this claim connects the Grand Canyon to a nationwide obsession that gripped America in the 19th century. An obsession that the Smithsonian Institution spent decades trying to extinguish. In the next part, we are going to talk about the giants. We are going to look at the mound builders, the Bible, and the strange, feverish belief that America was once ruled by men of unusual stature. Was Kincaid reporting what he saw? Or was he feeding a national hunger for a history that was bigger, taller, and stranger than the truth? If you open the newspaper archives of the United States from about 1850 to 1920, you will find something that looks, to modern eyes, absolutely bizarre. You will find hundreds, perhaps thousands, of reports of giant skeletons being unearthed. In Ohio, in West Virginia, in California, and yes, in Arizona. The headlines are remarkably consistent. Giant skulls found. Bones of a lost race discovered. Skeletons 7 feet tall unearthed in burial mound. G.E. Kincaid's claim that the mummies in the Grand Canyon citadel were of a giant race was not an isolated eccentricity. It was part of a national folklore. To understand why Kincaid put giants in his cave, we have to understand the psychological landscape of America at the turn of the century. This was a time when the origin of the massive earthen mounds found across the eastern United States, like the Cahokia Mounds or the Serpent Mound in Ohio, was a subject of fierce debate. White settlers moving westward found these monumental earthworks and refused to believe that the ancestors of the Native Americans they were displacing could have built them. It was a convenient racism. If the Indians didn't build the mounds, then who did? The popular theory was the lost race of mound builders. This hypothetical race was often described as white, civilized, and frequently giant. They were the true ancient Americans, the story went, who were wiped out by the savage tribes that the settlers were now fighting. It was a narrative that justified conquest. We aren't stealing the land, we are reclaiming it for the ghosts of the giants. This myth was fueled by the Bible. Genesis speaks of the Nephilim, giants in the earth in those days. For a deeply religious populace, finding physical proof of giants was a way to validate Scripture. So, every time a farmer plowed up a large femur, or a town doctor mismeasured a skull, it became proof of the Nephilim. Enter the Smithsonian Institution. Under the leadership of men like John Wesley Powell, whom we met earlier, the Smithsonian launched a massive scientific campaign to crush the lost race myth. Powell and his Bureau of Ethnology sent agents across the country to excavate the mounds and prove definitively that they were built by the ancestors of the Native Americans. And they succeeded. by 1894, the Smithsonian published a landmark report stating there was no lost race, no giants, and that the indigenous people were the sole architects of American prehistory. But this scientific victory came at a cost. It created a deep, lingering distrust between the public and the institution. People wanted the giants to be real. They wanted the romance of the lost race. When the Smithsonian said, "No, these are just normal bones," the public heard they are hiding the truth. This is the fertile soil in which the Kincaid story took root. When Kincaid, or the Gazette writer, mentioned giant mummies, they were blowing a dog whistle to every amateur archaeologist and biblical literalist in the country. They were saying, "The Smithsonian is wrong, and we found the proof in a hole in Arizona." The conspiracy theory that the Smithsonian actively destroys or hides giant bones was born in this era, and it persists today. Kincaid's cave is often cited as the central warehouse of this cover-up. The logic goes, if they found thousands of giant mummies in 1909, and the Powell Doctrine said giants didn't exist, they had to make them disappear. But let's look at the giants themselves. Is there any biological basis for this? Humans have grown taller over time due to nutrition, but a race of 8 or 9-foot warriors is biologically problematic. Square cube law, joint stress, caloric requirements. Physics is not kind to giants. However, perception matters. The average height of a man in 1900 was about 5 feet 7 inches. If Kincaid found mummies that were 6 feet 4 inches tall, but human, wrapped in bulky clay layers that added volume, they might have looked like titans to him. Or perhaps he was seeing what he expected to see. But the legend of giants in the Southwest isn't just a white settler fantasy. The Paiute tell of the Sitapuni, a tribe of red-haired giants who lived in Lovelock Cave in Nevada, not far from the canyon. According to the legend, the Paiute fought a war of extermination against these giants, eventually trapping them in the cave and setting a fire at the mouth to suffocate them. When guano miners excavated Lovelock Cave in 1911, just 2 years after Kincaid, they found thousands of artifacts and, allegedly, human remains of unusual size. Some skulls were reported to be massive. Most of these bones have disappeared or were reburied, but the story of the Sitapuni provides an indigenous corroboration to the giant motif. Did Kincaid know about the Lovelock legends, or was he tapping into a universal archetype? Giants represent the great ancients, the powerful beings who came before us. By populating his citadel with giants, Kincaid elevated it from a human ruin to a mythical one. It made the discovery feel impossible to accept, and therefore impossible to disprove. The Smithsonian's denial of Kincaid is often viewed through the lens of this giant cover-up. Theorists argue that the institution couldn't admit to the Kincaid find because it would validate the very myths they had spent 30 years destroying. It would undo the work of Powell. It would embrace the barbarism of the Bible over the civilization of Darwin. So, the giants had to go. Whether they were dumped in the ocean, incinerated, or stacked in a classified basement, they were removed from history. This is the tragedy of the giant myth. It obscures the real, fascinating history of the people who actually lived there. The ancestral Puebloans, the Kohonina, the makers of the split-twig figurines. They were not giants in stature. but they were giants in resilience. They survived in a landscape that kills the unprepared. But regular humans aren't enough for a story like Kincaid's. He needed monsters. He needed gods. And in 1909, nothing sold a newspaper faster than a giant. Today, the giant skeletons of the 19th century papers are regarded as hoaxes, misidentified mastodon bones, or exaggerations. But the psychological scar remains. The belief that science is lying to us about our origins finds its strongest root here. And nowhere is that distrust more evident than in the modern restrictions of the Grand Canyon. If the giants are gone, why are the caves still gated? Why are there no fly zones? Why does the military fly black helicopters through the gorge? In the next part, we will fast forward to the present day. We will leave the dusty newspapers and look at the satellite maps, the restricted airspace, and the modern reports of strange activity in the forbidden zones. The giants may be dead, but the secrecy is very much alive. We have spent hours drifting through the past, sifting through the sands of 1909 and the legends of the Hopi. But a mystery is only truly alive if it breathes in the present. If the Grand Canyon was simply a graveyard of forgotten myths, we could close the book and walk away. But the canyon does not feel like a graveyard. It feels like a fortress. And for those who try to look too closely at its secrets today, it can feel like a prison. When you visit the Grand Canyon National Park, you are handed a map. It shows the scenic drives, the visitor centers, the designated trails where you can walk safely with your water bottle and your camera. It is a curated experience designed to show you the beauty while keeping you firmly on the surface. But what the map doesn't show you are the blank spaces. The vast majority of the canyon's 1 million acres is classified as backcountry. And within that backcountry, there are areas where human footsteps are discouraged, if not outright forbidden. The official reason is conservation. The canyon is a fragile ecosystem. The cryptobiotic soil, that crunchy black crust you see on the desert floor, takes decades to grow and can be destroyed by a single boot print. The caves are home to endangered bat species and rare plants like the Welsh's milkweed. To protect these treasures, the National Park Service restricts access. This is reasonable. It is logical. It is what we expect from stewards of the land. But for those who chase the ghost of G.E. Kincaid, these restrictions look less like conservation and more like containment. They point to the forbidden zones, areas near the confluence of the Colorado and Little Colorado rivers, or the cliffs around the Isis Temple, where permits are nearly impossible to obtain, and where hikers report an unusual level of surveillance. Let's talk about Stanton's Cave. This is a massive cavern in the Redwall Limestone, located in Marble Canyon, not far from where Kincaid's citadel was supposedly found. It is a real cave, documented and explored. In the past, it was open. But today, if you manage to raft down the river and hike up to its mouth, you will not find an open door. You will find steel. The entrance to Stanton's Cave is barred by a massive gate of heavy steel beams, welded directly into the ancient rock. It looks less like a park ranger's fence and more like the gate of a bank vault or a dungeon. The official sign says it is to protect a colony of Townsend's big-eared bats. And indeed, the bats are there. But for the conspiracy theorist standing in the sweltering heat, looking at those bars, the question arises. Is the gate there to keep people out or to keep something else in? There are rumors that Stanton's cave goes much deeper than the maps show. That beyond the bat colony and the fossil beds, the tunnel system connects to a larger network, perhaps the very network Kincaid described. By gating the entrance, the authorities have effectively put a padlock on the mystery. They have controlled the narrative. You can read about the giant ground sloth dung found there, but you cannot go in and see if the tunnel turns into a hallway. Then there is the air. The Grand Canyon has some of the most restricted airspace in the United States, outside of military bases and Washington, D.C. Most of this is, again, for logical reasons. Noise pollution from helicopters and planes ruins the natural silence of the park. After a tragic collision of two tour planes in 1956, the FAA tightened the rules significantly. But there are whispers among private pilots of specific no-fly zones that don't appear on the standard aeronautical charts, patches of air where radios go dead or where GPS signals scramble. Some researchers claim that these zones correlate perfectly with the locations of the named monuments: the Tower of Ra, the Temple of Set. Why would the air above a rock formation be sensitive? Unless, of course, there is something down there that can be seen from the sky, something that satellite imagery has been scrubbed to hide. This brings us to the military connection. It is an open secret that the military uses the vast, empty spaces of the American Southwest for training. But reports of black triangles, silent triangular aircraft, gliding through the canyon corridors at night are persistent. Why fly in the canyon? Is it just for terrain masking training, learning to fly below radar, or is there a base down there? The idea of a deep underground military base, DUMB, sounds like the plot of a thriller, but the geology of the canyon is perfect for it. The thick layers of rock provide natural shielding against nuclear strikes. The isolation guarantees privacy. If you wanted to hide a facility or investigate an ancient one you found, the Grand Canyon is the ultimate cover. Hikers who have bushwhacked into the forbidden zones, ignoring the lack of trails and the danger of dehydration, have returned with unsettling stories. They speak of hearing a low-frequency hum emanating from the ground, a mechanical vibration that can be felt in the teeth more than heard with the ears. This Grand Canyon hum is often dismissed as the sound of distant generators from the tourist centers carrying on the wind, or the flow of the river echoing against the walls. But the hum is described as rhythmic, industrial. It sounds like heavy machinery working deep within the crust. Is it mining? Is it excavation? Or is it the ventilation system that Kincaid described, still whirring away after thousands of years? There is also the phenomenon of the men in black, not the aliens of Hollywood, but unmarked law enforcement. There are accounts of hikers near the Isis temple being approached by armed men in unmarked uniforms, without Park Service badges, and being told to turn back immediately. No explanation, no citation, just a threat. This area is closed. If the canyon is just a park, why the need for anonymity? Why the heavy hand? Skeptics will say these are exaggerations, stories told to spice up a boring hike. They will say the armed men were likely looking for drug smugglers or illegal poachers, which is a real problem in border states. But the pattern of secrecy is undeniable. In 1956, two commercial airplanes collided over the canyon, falling into the gorge near the confluence. It was a horrific tragedy. But the cleanup operation opened up parts of the canyon that had never been accessed before. Helicopters, military personnel, and federal agents swarmed the area. Some theorists believe that during this recovery mission, something else was found. Something that had been revealed by the crash or the subsequent fires. Since 1956, the restrictions on canyon airspace and exploration have only tightened. And what of the artifacts? If the Smithsonian did take them, they aren't talking. But there are rumors of a black vault within the museum, a place where the out-of-place artifacts, parts, are kept. Kincaid's mummies, the copper swords, the tablets with hieroglyphics, they are said to be there labeled as hoaxes or misidentified 19th century kitsch, gathering dust in the dark. The modern mystery of the Grand Canyon is a mystery of bureaucracy. It is a puzzle of redacted files, denied permits, and gated caves. It is the feeling you get when you look at a map and see a large blank spot labeled restricted. It triggers the primal instinct that says, the good stuff is hidden there ... We are told that the canyon is fully explored. We are told that satellites see everything, but satellites cannot see under the rock. They cannot see into the shadows of a north-facing cliff, and they cannot see the intent of the people who draw the borders. The forbidden zones effectively keep the Kincaid story alive by preventing anyone from disproving it. If we could walk freely into every cave in Marble Canyon, we might find nothing but bat guano and dust, and the mystery would die. By keeping us out, the powers that be, whether they are protecting bats or ancient machines, guarantee that the legend grows. But there is another possibility. One that bridges the gap between the ancient Hopi legends and the modern UFO sightings. What if the secrecy isn't protecting a ruin? What if it's protecting a residence? What if the ant people didn't leave? In the modern era, we don't call them ant people. We have a new vocabulary for the strange humanoids that seem to haunt our planet. We call them aliens. But perhaps we are looking at the sky when we should be looking at the ground. Perhaps the lights seen dipping into the canyon aren't visitors from Alpha Centauri. Perhaps they are the neighbors. In the next part, we will explore the cryptoterrestrial hypothesis. We will look at the work of researchers who believe that a sister species to humanity has evolved right alongside us, hidden in the geological honeycombs of the Earth. And we will ask if the Grand Canyon is their capital city. We have looked for Egyptians. We have looked for giants. We have looked for secret government bases. But there is one theory that combines all the strangeness of the Grand Canyon into a single, cohesive, and deeply unsettling narrative. It is the theory of the cryptoterrestrials. The term was popularized by the late researcher Mac Tonnies. His idea was simple but revolutionary. What if the aliens we report seeing, the greys, the humanoids, the strange beings in metallic crafts, are not extraterrestrial at all? What if they are indigenous? What if they are from here? The theory proposes that a sister branch of humanity, or perhaps a distinct species of hominid, diverged from us hundreds of thousands of years ago. While we developed on the surface, spreading out, building with fire and stone, and eventually silicon, they took a different path. They went underground. Or perhaps they always lived in the margins, in the places we couldn't reach. The Grand Canyon is the perfect habitat for such a species. If you wanted to hide a civilization from the surface world, you wouldn't build it in the open plains of Africa or the forests of Europe. You would build it in the negative spaces. You would build it in the crust. The geology we discussed earlier, the vast karst systems, the solution caves, the miles of tunnels in the Redwall Limestone, provides the infrastructure. The Hopi legends of the ant people describe beings that sound suspiciously like the modern gray alien. Large heads, spindly limbs, telepathic communication. The Paiute legends of the Havmusufs describe fair-skinned humans with high technology and flying ships. Are these myths? Or are they eyewitness accounts of our subterranean neighbors? The cryptoterrestrial hypothesis solves many of the problems of the ancient city mystery. Kincaid described a city that seemed ancient but also technologically advanced, hardened copper ventilation. If this city belonged to a long-lived, slow-advancing underground society, the mix of ancient and tech makes sense. They wouldn't build skyscrapers. They would adapt the stone. They wouldn't use fossil fuels. They might use geothermal energy or something cleaner, something that doesn't poison their enclosed air. This theory also aligns with the modern UFO phenomenon in the canyon. There have been hundreds of reports of UFOs in Arizona, but in the canyon, these objects often behave differently. They are seen entering and exiting the Earth. They are seen hovering near cave mouths. If these are extraterrestrials from a star system 50 light-years away, why do they care about a hole in Arizona? Why are they obsessed with our geology? But if they live here, if this is their front door, then their presence makes perfect sense. They are not exploring. They are commuting. The concept of the ant people takes on a new biological realism here. Evolution in a low-light, underground environment would favor certain traits. Large eyes to capture available photons. Pale skin due to lack of sunlight. A smaller, slighter build to navigate narrow tunnels. A reliance on telepathy or high-frequency sound for communication in the dark. The grays fit the profile of a cave-adapted primate perfectly. And what about the silence? If there is a civilization down there, why don't they talk to us? Tawnies and others suggested that they are few in number, that they are fragile. Perhaps they view us, the violent, explosive, resource-hungry surface dwellers, as a threat. They hide because they are afraid of us. Or perhaps they view us as a failed experiment, a dangerous younger sibling that needs to be managed from the shadows. The hum reported by hikers, the mechanical vibrations deep in the rock, could be the sound of their industry. Not a military base, but a life support system for a species that shares our planet but not our reality. This perspective reframes Kincaid's discovery entirely. He didn't find a tomb of dead Egyptians. He stumbled into the periphery of a living world. The mummies he found might not have been ancient ancestors. They might have been the recently deceased of this cryptoterrestrial group, treated with preservation methods we don't understand. The statue might have been a representation of their own phenotype, which Kincaid's mind, searching for a reference labeled Buddha-like. It is a radical thought. It challenges our assumption that we are the masters of the planet. We assume that because we have mapped the surface, we own the place. But the surface is just the skin of the apple. The flesh of the fruit is deep, and we have barely bitten into it. The Grand Canyon, with its vertical mile of exposure, is one of the few places where the skin is peeled back. It is a window into the deep earth. If there is a hidden humanity, this is exactly where we would expect to bump into them. This theory also explains the high strangeness of the region, the missing time reports, the feelings of being watched, the bizarre coincidences. If we are dealing with a species that has developed psychic or consciousness-altering technologies, perhaps as a way to remain hidden, then the canyon acts as a psychic amplifier. The Have-Musovs of the Paiute tradition were said to have weapons that could stun without touching. They had silver canoes that flew without wings. This sounds like magic to a 19th century Paiute. To us, it sounds like directed energy weapons and anti-gravity propulsion. If a civilization had millions of years to evolve in isolation, unbothered by the surface wars and cataclysms, how far ahead of us might they be? Maybe they aren't aliens or gods. Maybe they are just the smart ones who stayed inside when the weather got bad. The cryptoterrestrial hypothesis is, admittedly, fringe. It sits on the edge of science fiction. But it is a necessary piece of the puzzle. It bridges the gap between the folklore of the past and the UFO lore of the present. It suggests that the mystery isn't an event that happened 5,000 years ago. It is a relationship that is happening right now. As we near the end of our journey, we have to confront the institution that stands between us and these theories. We have to talk about the nature of science itself. Not the method, but the establishment. Why is archaeology so resistant to these ideas? Is it a conspiracy? Or is it a mechanism of self-defense? In the next part, we will discuss the science of silence. We will look at why anomalies are rejected, why careers are destroyed for asking the wrong questions, and why, if Kincaid's cave really exists, it is scientifically necessary for it to remain lost. The greatest gate in the Grand Canyon isn't made of steel. It's made of dogma. We have spent this long night wandering through caves, deciphering myths, and peering into the restricted airspace of the American Southwest. We have entertained possibilities that would make a textbook historian shudder. But now, we must face the most formidable obstacle of all. It is not a gate made of steel, nor is it a sheer cliff of Redwall Limestone. It is an invisible wall, built of paper, peer review, and the rigid consensus of the academic world. We must talk about the science of silence. When people hear the phrase Smithsonian conspiracy, they often imagine a smoke-filled room where powerful men in suits decide to hide the truth from the public. They imagine a warehouse like the one in Indiana Jones, where the Ark of the Covenant is crated up and forgotten. And, while that is a compelling image, the reality of how science handles forbidden discoveries is often far more subtle and far more effective. Archaeology, like any science, is built on a foundation of established facts. It is a slow, careful process of adding brick upon brick to the wall of knowledge. But sometimes, a discovery comes along that doesn't just add a brick, it threatens to knock the whole wall down. These are called anomalies. And the scientific reaction to an anomaly is rarely excitement. It is usually rejection. In 1909, when G.E. Kincaid supposedly walked out of the canyon with his story of an Egyptian citadel, the wall of American archaeology was just being built. The architects of that wall, men like John Wesley Powell, were fighting a hard battle to establish the legitimacy of their field. They were trying to prove that the Native Americans were the architects of their own history, independent of the Old World. They were fighting against the rampant racism and wild speculation of the 19th century that attributed every mound and ruin to lost white races, or the tribes of Israel. To admit that Kincaid was right, to admit that there were Egyptians or Tibetans or giants in the Grand Canyon, would have been a catastrophe for the emerging science. It would have validated the cranks. It would have undone decades of careful work. So, the system did what systems always do. It protected itself. It didn't need a conspiracy, it just needed a filter. This filter is what we call the paradigm. In the mid-20th century, the philosopher Thomas Kuhn explained that science doesn't move in a straight line. It stays in a paradigm, a set of agreed-upon truths, until the anomalies become too numerous to ignore. Then, and only then, does it shift. For American archaeology, the paradigm was isolationism. The Americas were cut off. There was no contact before the Vikings. Anything that challenged this, be it a Roman coin found in a mound, a Norse rune in Minnesota, or a Buddha in Arizona, was automatically labeled a hoax. It had to be a hoax because it couldn't be true. This circular logic is the science of silence. It is not malicious. It is structural. If a young archaeologist in 1920 had tried to investigate Kincaid's cave, he wouldn't have been assassinated. He would have simply been denied funding. He would have been laughed out of the faculty lounge. His career would have withered on the vine. That is how you hide a city. You don't need to blow up the entrance. You just need to make it career suicide to look for it. We see this pattern repeated over and over. Consider the Clovis First hypothesis. For decades, it was absolute dogma that humans arrived in the Americas about 13,000 years ago via the Bering Land Bridge. Any archaeologist who claimed to find older sites, like the Bluefish Caves or Monteverde, was ostracized. They were called an incompetent. Their data was questioned. It took 50 years of fighting for the pre-Clovis truth to finally be accepted. The citadel in the canyon faces an even steeper climb. It challenges not just the when of history, but the who. But what about the physical evidence? Where are the artifacts? If Kincaid really shipped relics to Washington, where did they go? Museums are vast places. The Smithsonian Institution holds over 150 million items in its collections. Only a tiny fraction, less than 1%, is ever on display. The rest sits in drawers, in lockers, in off-site storage facilities in Maryland and Virginia. Items are often mislabeled, misplaced, or simply forgotten. It is entirely possible that crates labeled Arizona 1909 pottery are sitting on a shelf right now gathering dust. But there is another possibility, one known as the OOPART phenomenon, out-of-place artifacts. When a museum receives an item that doesn't fit the narrative, it is often classified as problematic. If a donor sends in a copper sword from the Grand Canyon, the curator looks at it, sees that it looks Egyptian, and assumes it is a fake. It is a 19th century reproduction brought back by a tourist and dropped in a cave. So it gets labeled modern reproduction and filed away. The evidence isn't destroyed. It is reclassified into irrelevance. This bureaucracy of silence is far more powerful than any cover-up. It relies on the skepticism of honest people. It relies on the fact that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, But the evidence is never extraordinary enough if you refuse to look at it. And let us not forget the role of the government. The Grand Canyon is federal land. It is a national park, but it is also a strategic asset. The uranium mines on the North Rim are a matter of national security. The airspace is controlled. If there were something down there, whether it be an ancient city, a cryptoterrestrial habitat, or just a massive geological anomaly, the government has the legal authority to restrict access. We see this with the gated caves like Stanton's cave. We are told it is for the bats, and it is for the bats. But it is also convenient. It keeps the amateurs out. It keeps the flashlight beams from wandering too deep. It maintains the control of the environment. In the modern world, mystery is a liability. It invites trespassers. It invites liability lawsuits. It invites chaos. The safest canyon is a known canyon, a mapped canyon, a silent canyon. So, when we ask why we haven't found the city, we have to look at the tools we are using. We are using the tools of modern science, which are designed to find things that fit the model. We are looking for campsites, for pot shards, for things we recognize. We are not looking for the impossible. There is a concept in psychology called inattentional blindness. If you are focused intensely on counting the passes of a basketball in a video, you will completely miss a person in a gorilla suit walking through the frame. Archaeology is focused on the basketball. Kincaid's city is the gorilla. We don't see it because we aren't looking for it. We are looking for what we are told is there. But the science of silence has cracks. The internet has democratized research. People are flying drones, illegally, into the canyons. They are using LiDAR data to scan the vegetation. They are sharing stories on forums, bypassing the academic gatekeepers. The Kincaid story, which was buried for 50 years, is now more alive than ever. This is the danger of silence. It breeds noise. By refusing to address the mystery, by issuing blanket denials, the institutions have created a vacuum that is filled by speculation. If the Smithsonian had simply said, "We looked, and here is the empty cave," the story might have died. But the denial, "We have no record of Kincaid," is what keeps it alive. It feels like a lie. The Grand Canyon is a place of deep time. It exposes the history of the Earth layer by layer. It teaches us that nothing is permanent. Not the rocks, not the rivers, and certainly not our theories. The science of silence is just another layer, a thin crust of dogma sitting on top of a mystery that is millions of years deep. Eventually, that crust will break. Someone will find the entrance. A rock slide will reveal a chamber. A drone will capture an image that cannot be explained away. And when that happens, the silence will end. The paradigm will shift. And we will have to rewrite the history of the world. But until then, the canyon keeps its counsel. It allows us to project our fears and our dreams onto its walls. It allows us to believe in the safety of our textbooks. It is a patient teacher. It knows that truth, like water, eventually finds a way through the stone. In the final part of our journey, we will step back from the edge. We will look at the Grand Canyon not as a crime scene or a scientific puzzle, but as a mirror. What does our obsession with this lost city tell us about ourselves? And where do we go from here, now that we know the map is not the territory? We are standing now at the end of the trail. We have traveled from the dusty streets of 1909 Phoenix to the high-tech silence of modern drone surveillance. We have descended past the Kaibab Limestone, through the Torowayup, the Coconino, the Hermit Shale, all the way down to the blood-red cliffs of the Redwall, where the secrets are kept. We have met G.E. Kincaid, the man who might have been a ghost. We have met the Hopi elders who speak of the ant people. We have met the Paiute storytellers who remember the flying silver canoes. We have looked at the maps named after Egyptian gods and the caves barred by American steel. And after all of that, you are left with a question. Is it real? Is there right now, as you listen to this, a silent, dust-filled city sleeping in the dark of Marble Canyon? Is there a statue holding a lotus flower, waiting for a light that hasn't shone for a century? The honest answer, the answer that respects both the science and the mystery, is that we don't know. And perhaps that is exactly how it should be. The Grand Canyon is more than a geological feature. It is a psychological one. It is a tear in the fabric of our comfortable reality. It is too big for our minds to hold. When we stand on the rim, we feel small. We feel temporary. And in that vertigo, we feel a desperate need to fill the void with something human. We cannot bear the idea that the canyon is just empty rock. It is too grand for that. It demands a story. And so, we fill it. Kincaid filled it with Egyptians. The Hopi filled it with ancestors. The modern conspiracy theorist fills it with aliens and government bases. The canyon becomes a mirror. It reflects our own desires, our own fears, and our own need for connection to the deep past. If Kincaid's story was a hoax, it was a magnificent one. It was a hoax that spoke to the deepest longing of the human spirit, the longing to find a lost chapter, a secret door that leads to a world of magic and wonder. We want the world to be older and stranger than we are told. We want to believe that there is more to discover. In a world where every square inch is mapped by satellites, where every mystery is debunked by Snopes, the Grand Canyon remains one of the last bastions of the unknown. It is the great unknown of Major Powell, and it refuses to be fully tamed. Even if the citadel isn't there in the physical sense, it exists now in the landscape of our imagination. You cannot look at the Isis temple without wondering. You cannot look at a dark cave mouth in the Redwall without feeling a flicker of possibility. Kincaid created a modern myth, a ghost story that haunts the canyon as surely as the wind. But let us not dismiss the physical possibility too quickly. As we discussed, the geology allows it. The history of the split-twig figurines proves that humans were there. The indigenous legends provide a cultural mandate for the underground. The silence of the scientific record leaves room for the anomaly. The Grand Canyon is vast. It is a labyrinth of side canyons, fissures, and caves that would take 1,000 lifetimes to explore. It is arrogant to assume we know everything that is hidden in its folds. The earth is a keeper of secrets, and it does not give them up easily. Maybe the city is there, buried by a rock slide in 1910, sealed away forever. Maybe it was cleansed by the Smithsonian, the artifacts scattered to the winds. Or maybe, just maybe, it is still there, open and waiting, protected only by the sheer impossibility of the climb. There is a beautiful, haunting thought in the idea of the forbidden underground. It reminds us that we are guests on this planet. We walk on the surface, under the sun, but there are layers beneath us that we do not own. There are histories that do not belong to us. The Hopi say the Sipapuni is the place of emergence. It is where we came from and where we will return. It connects us to the earth in a way that a skyscraper never can. To wonder about the underground city is to wonder about our roots. It is to ask, who are we, and where are we going? As we close this file, I want you to imagine yourself standing on the edge of the rim at twilight. The sun is setting, casting long, purple shadows across the temples of stone. The river is a silver thread, miles below. The wind is rising, carrying the scent of pine and ancient dust. Somewhere out there, in that vast ocean of silence, is the truth. Maybe it is a copper sword. Maybe it is a willow deer. Maybe it is just the quiet hum of the earth itself. But it is there. And as long as the canyon stands, the mystery will call to us. It invites us to keep looking, to keep questioning, to keep wandering off the map. Because the world is not finished. The map is not complete. And the mysteries beneath the earth are waiting for those patient enough to listen. Thank you for journeying with me into the dark tonight. I hope you found some wonder in the shadows. If you enjoyed this exploration of the impossible, if you like the feeling of a question that hangs in the air like smoke, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps us keep the lantern lit. It helps us find the next trail. Until next time, sleep well. And remember, the ground beneath your feet is deeper than you think.